I'm Petroc Trelawny. I present the breakfast programme on Radio 3, and it's my great honour to be introducing tonight's Hallé movie classics, which will be conducted by Stephen Bell, who is Associate Conductor of the Hallé Pops. You are very much involved in shaping the pop season here at the Bridgewater Hall, so as this is the first concert in the 2019-2020 season, it might be good just to talk through a few of the highlights.
I'm very happy to do that, yes. As I'm sure if you're regular visitors to these concerts, you will know that certainly this is the beginning of my seventh season, actually, curating these series of concerts in conjunction with Sue Voisey and the artistic planning team here at the Halle. And I kind of love that whole creative thing, that it's lovely to start with a blank sheet of paper for a concert, but it's even more exciting to start with a blank sheet of paper on the sort of year planner, if you like, to be able to kind of slot as wide a variety of concerts. That's, I think, the key for me, to appeal to as broad an audience as we possibly can. And yes, some of the things that come back quite regularly, some of the sort of regular features of our season, you would expect the sort of Christmas concerts and all that kind of thing. But actually, increasingly, we found that one of the things that's really particularly successful is movie music, which is a particular passion of mine, as we've discussed this before. And it happens in various guises, because you can do a sort of generic film night or an Oscars night or a John Williams night or whatever. But increasingly, we're finding new ways to kind of bring that medium, if you like. Later this season, we've got a series of concerts with a movie theme, one of which is the best of British, where we've taken extracts of a whole raft of British cinema.
Including the Carry On films.
Including a little bit of Carry On, there we go. But we thought it was interesting to put, with this particular concert in mind, to perhaps hone it in a little bit more towards where directors have taken their inspiration musically and taken stuff off the shelf, if you like. They've literally chosen pieces of existing classical music and shoehorned it into what they needed to create that atmosphere or to create that emotion. So we've kind of run with this a couple of times, and there's an embarrassment to riches. There's so much material out there, because obviously directors can go back in history and pick a whole raft of things. Some are really obvious. Some of the things we're doing tonight, if you've got an extract from a film such as Amadeus, for example, then obviously you would use some Mozart. If you've got a film that has a ballet theme at its core, such as Black Swan or Billy Elliot, then it's really obvious that you would choose a piece of Tchaikovsky's ballet music, because it kind of enhances what you're seeing on screen.
Not so obvious when it comes to Wagner and Apocalypse Now.
Well, that's where it gets interesting, where a director takes something and tries to almost shoehorn that emotion, if you like. He tries to take you on that journey with that particular music. Some are really obscure. We're going to do a couple of extracts from Stanley Kubrick's 2001: Space Odyssey. I mean, he chooses some pretty off-the-wall stuff there. There's some ligeti and all sorts of things that you perhaps wouldn't expect to be where they are in popular culture. So it's a really kind of interesting slant that directors take on that.
There are sort of three ways you can get music for a film, aren't there? I mean, you can either commission a score, which clearly lots of directors do. You can use existing celebrated music from history, which has the advantage quite often that you don't have to pay for it. Or you can use what's called library music. This is something that I suppose started really with the sort of 1920s, 1930s, and has grown and grown, where there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of recordings of mood music, something to suit every mood.
Yes, and when you say it's grown, I wonder whether perhaps it had reached a peak and maybe now it's not quite so much, I don't know. But then a director could say, oh yes, I want to create this atmosphere, and could go and find a piece of music that's already licensed, so he doesn't have to commission. And it is literally like a library. You can choose a piece of music that fits that particular mood. I'm not sure how often it's used now.
I would think not so much. But
I would think it's perhaps peaked. But it's really interesting, certainly for the purposes of this show tonight, to see where film directors would have taken their inspiration from well, quite a wide range. I mean, we're talking, right back to Mozart up to almost present day, aren't we? So there's a kind of huge range for them to choose from.
There's an interesting thing that sometimes happens with films, that the director commissions a composer to write a score and then doesn't use it, and instead uses well-known classical music. Brief Encounter,
indeed,
where Neil Matheson had been asked to write the soundtrack, and Noel Coward was a great fan of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, and as he was producer and writer, he kind of had
equal... And he had a cameo as well, didn't he?
And he had a cameo.
He had a little part.
He had sort of equal power with the director, so he said, look, let's base the score around Rachmaninoff, played by highly enjoys.
It was in the soundtrack.
And you hear the concerto straight, but then what Matheson did contribute were a few cues that are sort of inspired by it.
He did, and also you hear kind of snippets in the same way that you might hear background pop music or whatever on a radio or whatever. So that's kind of how that fed into that. I wonder how the composer felt, though, having sort of been commissioned to do this, and then none of it happens. And exactly the same happened. We've just talked about Stanley Kubrick and 2001 Space Odyssey, where Alex North was commissioned to write the score, and it was all done. It was all there and ready, and it was only, again, at the very last minute. I don't think he even knew.
He was invited to the premiere, and he went to the premiere
expecting to
hear his big opening tune for the film, and it wasn't there. And I guess he sat there thinking, okay, maybe it'll come in a bit, and it never came. And none of his music was used, and he was very upset. I mean, I think not surprisingly, I think he did sort of forgive Kubrick in the end, and eventually his score was recorded. In fact, it had been recorded for the film, but they then, of course, lost it in the great Hollywood style. And they re-recorded it with a proper orchestra in the early 90s. And it's very interesting, actually, to listen to how different the film would have been if they'd used...
Well, it would have been completely different.
Completely
it would have taken the viewer on a completely different journey, I guess.
I mean, I think one of the reasons this sometimes happens is because when a film director is putting a film together in the edit suite, they've shot all the pictures, dialogue's done, they can't change that. What they can change is the shape of the film through editing. They often want music, so they will borrow sometimes library music, but sometimes classical music that they know to accompany the pictures.
So that it's not to silence.
So it's not to silence. And then there have been various occasions, and I guess this is the case with a few of these, when they thought, well, actually, that's better. Elmer Bernstein, the great film music composer, Bernstein West, as he was described, wasn't he? Because Leonard Bernstein was Bernstein East and Bernstein East and Bernstein West, one in LA and one in New York. His career had dried up completely, and there was a film being made in the mid-1990s. I can't remember which one it was, and the director used some of his music from an earlier film. So, this guy's rather good, and got his secretary to phone up and say, is he still alive? And he was, and that relaunched Elmer Bernstein's
career. Did a resurgence. Yeah. Of course, it's so late in the process. This is the other thing with film music. It's just about the last part of the sort of post-production, isn't it, really? So often then it's the case of you have to record the soundtrack at the very 11th hour. It's all done and everything's cut and it's all kind of almost ready to release, isn't it, by the time the soundtrack goes on? Because obviously once the music's recorded, you can't then go, I need to cut a little bit off that. So it is one of the last parts of the process. It's also interesting for me as well when music takes over the dialogue. Was it Chris Nolan who directed Dunkirk, a quite recent film, which actually has got very little dialogue in it. Most of the kind of emotional heartland, if you like, of the film comes from the music. And he's not afraid to let the music take the viewer on the journey rather than do it with dialogue and have it explained. Which obviously opens up a whole new kind of world, doesn't it? Because you can then interpret as you wish where that particular music is taking you. It may remind you of something in your past, or it may trigger a memory or something, but it makes it almost more personal in a way, that it's not kind of predefined and done with a dialogue.
One of the tricky things for a film music composer is that they're expected to change things all the time, aren't they? I mean, down to that final, just before the final recording sessions, take a few bars out here, make this a bit longer.
Or even on the sessions, actually.
Or even
when you're recording it,
sessions,
let's change. Or could we just do, and there's a little element of trial and error.
So how does that work if you've got Tchaikovsky or Mozart? I mean, do you just take bits out of them? Or?
I think you would probably end up using recordings, and therefore you wouldn't need to re-record a soundtrack in the way you would for a commissioned work from a composer, where you can kind of mess around and do things with it and cut bars out and change them.
Because you've played on lots of soundtracks.
I've done quite a few, not an enormous amount, but in my former life as a horn player, I've been involved in a number of film soundtracks. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating to watch great masters at work. I mean, I had the great privilege of working with John Williams on a couple of Star Wars films, which is just, that you will never beat that, because the guy's an absolute genius, and it will always stick with me as a real career highlight to stand in the box and hear him talk to George Lucas about, well, if we did this, and the inner workings of something like that, where you have a huge orchestra and a huge chorus, and it's an expensive project, so time, pressures, budget, and all of that kind of thing. To see those guys at work is really, it's quite something. Yeah.
And British musicians are considered the best at it, aren't they? I mean, there was a period where it sort of went away. It went to to Central Europe.
It did go
to
out
Prague
to
and
Prague. City
Budapest.
Prague did quite a lot. Is that a budget thing? Is that a cost thing? I don't know. I'm not sure that it's not false economy, actually, because, as you say, British musicians have got a great reputation for being
And seem to have picked up that work
fantastic sight readers.
again there.
And therefore, per day or per session or whatever it is, it probably works out better because you can get the project done in half the amount of time. But yes, the British musicians do have a great reputation for being able to just read anything and give a polished performance first time through kind of thing, which is quite something.
It's interesting, isn't it? Just occasionally the film almost becomes better known than the piece of music. And I suppose the best example of that is the Mozart Piano Concerto, which comes from a film that was released, I think, in 1967. And really throughout the 70s and the 80s, people talked about it as the Elvira Madigan Concerto. You don't see it quite so much now, but it really did. It did sort of take over Mozart's writing.
Circus performer.
She was, who had an ill-fated affair with a Swedish nobleman.
There you go. I'm always slightly in awe, ladies and gentlemen. I was going to use the word. No, I'm not going to use that word. I'm always slightly in awe when I'm with Petroc, who's a walking encyclopedia, and we've been friends for a very long time. I do feel, I was going to say intimidator, but that's cruel. I don't mean intimidate in that respect, but your encyclopedic knowledge.
Well, we are talking about it tonight.
Far outstrips mine. But I did remember she was a Danish, I think. She was a Danish circus performer. Although it wasn't a Danish film, I think it might have been a Swedish film. But hey, we're splitting hairs here. But yes, it kind of makes the music take a life of its own. And of course, Mozart would have been thrilled that something like that would have happened to one of his piano concertos. I'm sure he would have been.
What do you think about what Stanley Kubrick did with, actually it wasn't Stanley Kubrick, it was, who directed Apocalypse Now? It was Francis Ford Coppola. The way he used this great operatic Ride of the Valkyries to cover a scene of incredibly upsetting devastation on the ground.
I think it's the menace as much as anything else, the sight of the helicopters and the fact that Wagner's music creates such tension. It's so powerful, but I think it's the underlying kind of menace and the inevitability, if you like, of what's about to happen.
Because the build-up was quite slow. I watched it again the other day, and he plays Go on the reel-to-reel tape machine, and Ride of the Valkyries bursts out from his helicopter, and there are about 20 helicopters flying in sequence. But the sort of sense from the helicopter crew and the men with their guns of when's this going to start? You know, the tension builds up and builds up.
There is,
and
but
builds
the music's like that because it has that kind of relentless pulse to it.
The two things sit together perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely. And the menace comes from that wonderful tune in the brass, but there's all of these kind of repeated figures that go on and around it. And that's what I think really creates the tension. That's kind of the driving force behind that.
I hadn't thought about what you said then, that if you're using a classical composer, you probably don't record the score, the music specifically. You probably do use recordings. Because I think that is, I mean, certainly it was Eileen Joyce, wasn't it, who recorded Rachmaninoff, as we said, for Brief Encounter, and that recording became very celebrated as a result.
Maybe one of the exceptions to that is Fantasia, which we do need to touch on because we're doing one of the 8 extracts or whatever there are from Disney's Fantasia, which was a great introduction to orchestral music for a whole generation of people, wasn't it, when it was released in 1940. And most of those, because it was the brainchild of Stokowski, most of those were specifically recorded, partly because some of them were slightly abridged versions. You don't get the whole of the Rite of Spring, for example. So he did use slightly different versions. So a lot of the music that you hear on Fantasia has been specially recorded for that, rather than using recordings off the shelf, as it were. But I suspect for a lot of other things, I don't think they re-recorded all the Ligeti, for example, in 1968 for Kubrick. I think it was probably they just used commercially available recordings.
I think that's the only time the conductor has had his name in bigger type than anyone else on a film poster. Fantasia, conducted by Leopold Stokowski.
But it was his. But it was.
Yeah,
I mean,
and there were no actors. Well, there was one person, wasn't there, who links
the whole thing. That's got a narrator. But he was the driving force behind that. I mean, even to the extent of he arranged the D minor toccata and fugue brilliantly for full orchestra. And yes, it really was his kind of driving force.
And you've almost got a vision of New York and Chicago being a bit sniffy about it and saying, I don't think we want to get involved in Hollywood. We'll leave that to Philadelphia. And my goodness.
But what a...
Yeah, they got that wrong.
Absolutely. What an extraordinary... You know, and the spin-offs of that, and there was the Fantasia 2000, and it has absolutely enthused a whole generation, or more than a generation, of people to get
it ought to be on television. I'm not sure it's ever on television these days. It ought to be on television every every 5 years.
I don't know, maybe it's dated, you know, it's
Yeah.
1940, wasn't it? So maybe some of the animation now isn't as slick as, you know, we have all this
Yes,
green
that's
stuff
true.
now, and maybe it wouldn't quite capture the imagination. But then, if we're talking, you know, during the wartime, that was just quite extraordinary to hear this music and see it all brought in full technical, and must have been really quite an eye-opener for somebody who had even the remotest interest in orchestral music. It really brought it to life.
And Brief Encounter, it feels, has almost made a kind of sort of journey on an arc, if you like, that it was incredibly cutting edge, then it didn't feel relevant. And now it's not that it feels relevant, but it feels like a vital piece of history almost.
Is that just
about,
are we just looking at it slightly more nostalgically? I don't know whether that's...
I think
whether
it's a
that's
very
the case.
fair portrait of relationships and from what I've read, of life at
In the
that time
1940s, yeah, maybe it was,
in this country. And it's very interesting to see them reflected so well, so interestingly on screen.
And so emotionally charged with a piece of music like the Rachmaninoff. But of course he never got to see it because he died just before the film was made. So.
Yeah. I think my favourite bit of that is where the Rachmaninoff is playing on the soundtrack, and then she suddenly comes round from her dream and it's playing on the radio, and her husband comes in, and it's a wonderful trick. That sort of gets me every time. One more thing before we finish, which is on the 29th of December, a lovely pause between Christmas and New Year. Skyfall, the James Bond film, will be on a huge
on a big screen, on the back of
here.
what we did last year with Casino Royale, which proved incredibly popular. These live cinema showings with the orchestra playing the soundtrack live.
And if you haven't been to one of them, I mean, it is a completely new experience. Certainly was when I went to.
It is
to one for the
extraordinary
first
because
time.
all they do is they take the orchestral soundtrack out of the mix. So you get all the dialogue, you get all the sound effects, you get everything except that the music is played live by the orchestra. Skyfall's not been done yet.
Is it not?
I think the premiere of it is next weekend in London. So we're going to be doing the second only ever performance here in Manchester. The screen goes
in front of the organ.
In front of the organ, so it drops down from the top of the...
It's really worth coming to one because they are extraordinary. Actually, they're you know, it's a completely different way of seeing a film and hearing the score. Is it quite tricky?
It's a great skill. I'm actually not conducting that. Ben Palmer's coming to conduct that, and it is. Does
it have a click track? Or?
It's a skill with sweeps and with time codes and with clicks and all sorts. So yeah, it is actually quite a. Because obviously
you don't want it drifting.
There is no room.
The car is being chased
That's
down
it.
the road.
There is no room for maneuver.
But the timpanist is a bar behind.
If you're doing a film that's 2.25 hours long, there ain't no stopping and starting again. So no, absolutely, it is quite an involved skill, which. In addition to what you see on the screen, there are also kind of helps and time codes and things and markings within the score to help, because obviously there are whole swathes of the film that don't have soundtrack to it. But yeah, it's a tricky operation to put something like that together. It is quite involved.
Good to leave it to someone else, actually.
Well,
particularly on the 29th of December.
Exactly.